Before we start the video, hit that subscribe button to support Battleground Stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. There is a sound within the Philippine forest that lies to you, a ticking sound like a metronome wrapped in a damp cloth. Tick, 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 tick. When the sound is loud, you feel it is close. You reach for your rifle. You scan the trees, but that's the trick. A loud sound means it's far away, and when the sound has faded to almost nothing, when you have to strain your ears to hear it, that's when it's already breathing down your neck. I learned this in 1942 in Capiz province. As the Japanese approached from the north, 11 American soldiers were sent to lay radio wire in the mangrove swamps. We thought the enemy was wearing uniforms. We were wrong. The villagers tried to warn us. Salt lines on every windowsill. Garlic braided over doorways. Axes placed blade out on thresholds. We laughed at them. Called it jungle superstition. Then Morrison vanished. No scream, no gunshot. Just his rifle standing in the mud like a headstone, and his dog tag swinging from a vine 12 feet up, where no man could reach without wings. What I'm about to tell you never made it into any official report, because some truths don't fit on army forms. I'm in Capiz, 1942, deep in the Philippine jungle where the air tastes like copper and rot. We weren't there chasing legends. We were sent to establish a radio relay, map escape routes, and wait for the Japanese to make their move south. But the jungle didn't care about our mission parameters. The locals whispered one word, like it carried its own kind of death. Aswang. They said it could smile at you in the morning market like your neighbor's wife, then split itself in half and come through your ceiling at midnight. Wings like oil-slicked leather. A tongue long enough to thread through bamboo slats and find the soft parts. We laughed it off at first, called it village superstition, campfire nonsense. Then Morrison disappeared without a sound. His rifle left standing in the mud like a grave marker. His dog tag hanging from a vine 12 feet up where no man could reach without a ladder. In the night, I saw that tongue sliding between the roof beams above my cot, tasting the air where I breathed. That's when the laughter died in my throat and never came back. We dropped into Capiz province in early February of '42, right after Bataan started looking like a lost cause. The heat hit you like walking into a wet mouth. Air so thick with humidity you could chew it. Salt and decay and something sweet underneath that you learn not to think about. Mangrove forests stretched in every direction, roots twisted up from black water like the fingers of drowned men reaching for something to pull down with them. The village folks watched us from their doorways as we humped through. No waves, no smiles. Just eyes that measured and calculated and decided we weren't worth the trouble of warning. We were 11 men, a signals detachment with more mosquito bites than combat experience. I was Corporal Nathaniel Brooks, radio operator, 23 years old, and still stupid enough to believe the Army knew what it was doing sending us here. Sergeant Holloway ran the show, big man with a voice like gravel in a coffee can and a plug of tobacco perpetually deforming his cheek. He'd done 2 tours in Nicaragua, chasing Sandino's boys through jungle that he claimed was worse than this. I believed him about the jungle. I didn't believe him when he said there was nothing in these trees we couldn't handle. Private Morrison was the youngest, 19, with a face full of freckles that made him look 16. He smiled at everything like the war was an adventure his parents had paid for. Doc Steinberg was our medic, a chain smoker from Brooklyn who swore his lungs were pickled enough to outlast all of us. He wasn't wrong, but not for the reasons he thought. We had 2 Philippine scouts attached to us, Sergeant Ramos and Corporal Villanueva. They knew the trails. They knew which plants would kill you and which ones just made you wish they had. They spoke less than the trees and watched more than the birds. Ramos had a way of going still when something bothered him, like a hunting dog catching a scent it didn't like. He went still a lot in Capiz. Mission was simple enough on the briefing map. String a relay antenna along the northern ridge. Maintain communication schedules with Divisional HQ. Chart 3 fallback routes to the coast. In case the Japanese push came faster than expected, we humped in light, rifles, field packs, 200 feet of antenna wire, kerosene lamps, and enough canned rations to make a man question his life choices. We set base camp by a tidal inlet, where the mangroves opened up enough to pitch tents without drowning in our sleep. The ground sucked at your boots if you stood still too long, made a sound like the earth was hungry. A massive tree dominated the camp clearing. A balit, they called it. Strangler fig that had wrapped itself around some host tree so long dead its bones had turned to powder inside the living wood. The thing looked like it couldn't decide if it wanted to be one tree or 50. Roots dropped from branches and became new trunks. Hollows gaped in the bark like mouths frozen mid-scream. I hated that tree on sight. Couldn't tell you why. Just something in the shape of it that made my teeth ache. Ramos wouldn't walk under it, wouldn't even look at it after dark. First night in camp, I caught him making a ring of salt around the radio tent, not asking permission, not explaining, just pouring from a canvas bag and patting it down into the mud with his palm like a mason sealing a foundation. Holloway watched him do it and snorted. "We keeping ghosts out now, Sergeant?" Ramos didn't answer. He just kept his eyes on the belat's roots, finished his circle, and walked away like the conversation hadn't happened. That night I logged the weather because that's what radio operators do. Barometer dropping, wind shifting off the sea. I wrote down unusual bird call at 0300 and felt stupid doing it. Unusual bird call, like putting it in Army format, made it less strange that the sound had come from inside my own tent and stopped the moment I opened my eyes. You know how a place gets into you? The smell first, diesel on canvas, fish drying on racks somewhere downwind, the sweet rot of mangrove leaves composting in their own sweat. Then the sounds, cicadas like a saw blade hitting knots. Nightbirds making calls that didn't match any field guide. Water sucking at roots like something drinking. And under all of it, a hollow space in the noise. A frequency where the jungle seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see if you'd notice the gap. We didn't notice. Not that first day. We were too busy being soldiers, driving antenna stakes into soil that didn't want them, testing radio frequencies through static that crackled like burning paper, arguing about whose turn it was to dig the latrine trench, pretending we weren't all counting the days until we could see a city street again. We walked into the village on our second evening to establish contact with local leadership. Straight line of nipa huts on bamboo stilts, floors slatted so the air could pass through and the cobras couldn't climb up. A woman with smoke in her hair sat on her porch steps and looked at my boots like they'd personally offended her ancestors. The barangay captain, a man named Ernesto with a jaw like a shovel blade, met us halfway with handshakes that felt more like warnings. They fed us rice and fish stew that tasted like the ocean had opinions about being eaten. Children watched our rifles with eyes too old for their faces. A teenage girl, maybe 17, kept her hands pressed flat against her swollen belly, like she was trying to hold something in or keep something out. The smoke from burning coconut husks clung to everything. It was supposed to keep the mosquitoes away. It didn't. The midwife came to us as the sun bled out below the tree line. They called her Lola Inde. Small woman, spine curved with age but eyes sharp as broken glass. Nobody interrupted when she spoke. Nobody looked away when she pointed. She waved me into the darkest corner of a hut and gestured at the window. A line of salt ran along the sill. Fresh, precise, the kind of careful that comes from practice. "You soldiers," she said, voice like dry leaves rubbing. "You will not laugh. Not in front of me. Not here." I told her I wouldn't. My mouth had gone dry without my permission. She held up a braid of garlic, the cloves yellowed and hard as old teeth. "Over every door," she said. "Always. Salt on every gap where air passes. Vinegar under the place you sleep. stingray tail by the threshold. She tapped a black braided whip hanging from a peg. The buntot paji. If it crosses your path, you strike. The sting burns it like fire. Morrison leaned in from behind me, grinning like this was a carnival sideshow. Burns what? She looked at him the way a teacher looks at the student who still can't read. Aswang. The room went quiet. Even the children stopped fidgeting. Even the smoke seemed to pause. I told her I didn't know the word. She made a face like that was the least surprising thing she'd heard all year. Then she told it to us not like a story, but like a set of instructions for surviving a flood. Woman by day, walks like you walk, smiles like your mother smiled, buys fish in the market, knows your name. At night it changes. Sometimes the body splits at the waist and the top half flies, just torso and head and arms, with wings like a bat made of shadows. Sometimes it crawls like a pig or a dog, but wrong, thin, hungry in a way that doesn't end. It has a tongue like a black rope. It can slip through any gap wide enough for air to pass. It drinks. It eats. It prefers the unborn, the sick, the ones who sleep alone. She leaned closer. I could smell tobacco and something bitter on her breath. Medicine or poison, hard to tell the difference here. You listen for the sound, she said. Tick-tick, tick-tick. If it is loud, it is far away. If it is soft, if you can barely hear it. She smiled without any warmth. Then it is already close. That is the trick. That is how it hunts. Do not be fooled. Captain Ernesto spoke from the doorway, arms crossed, face carved from the same wood as the trees outside. There are rules. Salt it cannot cross. Garlic it cannot stand. Vinegar burns its skin. Ash blinds it. These are the lines. These are what keeps the inside separate from the outside. He didn't mention mirrors. He didn't need to. The way the girl with the pregnant belly avoided the brass wash basin said enough. They told us the rest like soldiers reporting casualties. Flat, factual. The kind of voice you use when emotion won't change what happened. A water buffalo by the river, found drained to gray leather with no wound anyone could see. Hoof prints in the mud that started as human and became pig between one step and the next. A stranger who came to sit by a fire one night and refused when someone offered a cup of vinegar to drink. The dogs had hidden under the huts and cried until dawn. A newborn that looked healthy until they washed it and found the organs missing through a hole no bigger than a coin. A woman who borrowed a lantern in a storm. A week later, the baby in her neighbor's house came out white and empty like a rice paper shell. When that neighbor had polished her mirror afterward, she couldn't find her own reflection. The pregnant girl kept touching her belly. Her hands never stopped moving. I learned later her name was Rosario, 7 months along, and hadn't slept more than an hour at a stretch in weeks. Someone had placed an axe on her doorstep, blade facing outward. Someone else had poured vinegar around her house until the wood stained dark. Back at camp, we laughed. That's what men do when they don't want something to sink in. Jungle fairy tales. Old women keeping their daughters scared and obedient. Nothing that artillery and American engineering couldn't handle if it ever showed up on a target acquisition form. Holloway spat tobacco juice into the mangrove roots and called it all horseshit. Ramos didn't laugh. He strung a line of ash across our tent entrance and tucked garlic into the ridge rope. He gave each of us a look that said, "Humor me," without saying a word. I did. Morrison made a joke of it, hung 2 garlic cloves from his helmet strap like earrings, and struck a pose. Villanueva told me later, quiet, when the others were snoring, it is not all one thing. There are names for each shape it takes. Manananggal when it flies, Tick-tick when it crawls, but you only need to know one thing about all of them. He paused, checking that we were alone. They are patient, more patient than men. Patient for what? For you to forget the rules. I took the 0200 to 0400 watch because I don't sleep well in new places. The jungle noise had a way of crawling into your skull and nesting there. Moon laid a silver skin over the water where it showed between the mangrove roots. The radio was still warm against my leg from the evening transmission. The kerosene lamp made a yellow cone where moths flew in, burned, and dropped. At first, there was comfort in the noise. Frogs like leaky pipes. Insects sawing away at nothing. A night bird making a sound like someone clicking their tongue every few seconds. Far-off surf breaking on the reef. You could time your heartbeat to it if you tried. Then the jungle stopped, not gradually, not fading out, just off. Like someone had thrown a switch and forgotten to tell the night. You know that silence? Not peace, not rest, absence. The kind of quiet that happens in a hospital hallway before a doctor says your name. Every hair on my arm stood at attention. The smell changed too. The usual rot and salt replaced with something sweeter. Fruit going bad. And under it, metal, like an old canteen left full of rainwater too long. My tongue tasted copper. I licked my lips and got salt and something else, something I didn't have a name for. I looked up at the canvas above my head. A drop hit my cheek. Warm. I wiped it with the back of my hand and told myself a gecko had lost its manners. Told myself it was condensation. Told myself anything except what the texture had felt like against my skin. Tick-tick. Soft. So soft I almost thought I had imagined it. A faint click, like a metronome wrapped in cloth. Loud means far, I thought. Soft means close. My bones knew which one it was before my brain caught up. I stood slowly, reaching for my rifle without looking away from the canvas ceiling. The lamp flame leaned sideways, then straightened, like something had breathed on it from outside the tent. But there was no wind. The air hung dead and thick as wet cotton. Something moved across the path beyond the antenna line. Pig, I told myself. Just a pig rooting around in the garbage pit. But the legs were wrong. Too long, like a child wearing stilts made of bone. It didn't trot the way pigs trot. It shuffled, like it was remembering how to use the joints. And when the head turned to look toward my lamp, it turned too far. The neck bent at an angle that made my stomach drop through the floor. I blinked and it was gone behind the belate. I tried to laugh. It came out as a cough that hurt my chest. The tick-tick faded, growing louder as it grew more distant. The trick, I thought. The distance lie. Feathers beat past my ear, and I flinched so hard my knee cracked against the lamp table. A fruit bat, I told myself. Big damn fruit bat. They eat mangoes and scare Americans who don't know any better. I forced a breath in and let it out slow, counted to 10, told myself I was a soldier in the United States Army and I wasn't going to be frightened by pig sounds and bird shit. Morrison came to relieve me at 0400, still had garlic on his chin strap, still smiling like this was all a grand joke we'd tell back home. Your watch now, I said, tried to keep my voice from shaking. He squinted up at the tent roof, smile fading. Corporal, he whispered, don't think I'm crazy, but I think there's something up there. We both stared at the canvas. We saw nothing but shadows and the dark shapes of branch shadows from outside. We heard nothing but our own breathing. We didn't wake the others. We should have. Morrison had the perimeter at 0347. I know because I wrote it down. He had a good patrol pattern, methodical, checking the tripwires we'd strung between the trees, counting off the tin cans we'd hung as primitive alarms. He looked back toward the tents too often. But that's better than not enough. Better to be nervous than confident in a place like this. At 0409, I whistled the soft two-note signal we used for check-ins. Nothing came back. That happened sometimes. Men stepped away to relieve themselves. Men got distracted lighting cigarettes in cupped hands. Men lost track of time, staring at shadows that might or might not be moving. I waited 1 minute, then another. Then the minutes started feeling like miles, each second stretching further than it should. At 0416, I woke Holloway with a hand on his shoulder and a finger to my lips. We went looking in a line, 5 paces between each man, just like the field manual prescribed. lanterns held low to catch tracks in the mud. Ramos and Villanueva moved like ghosts ahead of us, reading the ground the way literate men read newspapers. The mud told them everything. It said Morrison had walked his pattern, regular steps, boot heels sinking even in the wet soil. It said he'd stopped about 40 yards from camp, right where the trail curved around a stand of bamboo. It said his heels had dug in deep there, like he'd leaned backward hard, like something had grabbed him by the collar and pulled. Then the prints changed. The boot impressions melted into something else, something splayed and split down the middle, not quite pig hooves, not quite human feet. Something between that shouldn't exist in a world that made sense. The track line drifted toward the balit roots and stopped there like a sentence that forgot how to end. We found his rifle in the muck, magazine unseated and lying 3 feet away. Sling torn clean through, not cut. Torn, with fibers stretched and frayed like something had ripped it with terrible strength. And his webbing strap, his web belt with his canteen and ammo pouches, hung 8 feet up on a bamboo stalk, threaded through the chutes like someone had carefully placed it there. Someone on a ladder. Someone who could reach that high without leaving footprints. I hated that detail. Still do. It made me feel small in a way combat never had, like we were children playing at being soldiers while something older watched and waited. The smell hit us then. Not dead yet. Not the rot of a corpse left to bloat. This was different. Sweet, like fish sauce left in the sun. And underneath that, something fouler. Something that made Steinberg gag and curse and gag again while the rest of us pretended we weren't fighting the same battle. We widened the search pattern, pushed further into the mangroves, where the water turned from mud to actual standing pools. The tin cans on our alarm lines clinked against each other on the far side of camp, but there was no wind. The antenna wire hummed a low frequency, even though the radio was cold and dead. The jungle stayed silent. That was worst, I think. Not the sounds, but the absence of them. Like everything that lived here was holding its breath. Like the whole forest was listening to see what we'd do next. Dawn came slow, bleeding through the canopy like a wound that wouldn't clot. The villagers arrived in a tight group, not quite a crowd, but more than casual visitors. Captain Ernesto made a cross of ash in our doorway. Women I didn't recognize pounded garlic in wooden mortars until the smell burned my eyes. Lola Inde walked the perimeter of our camp, sprinkling vinegar from a clay jug until the air stung with it. "Someone invited it in," she said, not looking at anyone in particular. "That is how it works. Someone left a gap. Someone forgot a rule." Someone smiled back. "Invited what?" Holloway snapped. He was tired and scared and angry about being scared, which made him dangerous in a different way. "What exactly are we supposed to be fighting here?" The old woman finally met his eyes. Her face was calm in a way that made my stomach drop. "Something wore a face and smiled at one of you in the daylight. It looked at your salt lines. It saw where the gaps were. At night, it came through those gaps." She paused. "You cannot fight what you do not believe in, Sergeant, but it believes in you. That is enough." I wanted to tell her to stop. I wanted to tell her she was wrong and we were soldiers, and soldiers didn't believe in monsters that wore human faces in the daylight. But she wasn't wrong. And I think she knew. I knew it. Villanueva found a tuft of something near the ballet roots. Not pig hair, not human hair. Coarse and black and wrong in some way I couldn't articulate. Too thick, too oily. Bristles that seemed to move even after he'd plucked them from the bark. He wrapped them in oiled paper and handed them to me like I was supposed to know what to do with evidence of the impossible. I put them in a specimen pouch and avoided touching them with my bare skin. Someone mentioned, quiet and sideways, that a pregnant woman 2 villages over had been found at dawn. She was alive. Her belly wasn't. Empty and deflated like something had drunk what was inside through a straw. People spoke softly about it and didn't look toward Rosario's house where the axes still guarded the threshold. We sat on ammunition crates and didn't talk. Not about Morrison, not about the prints that changed, not about the webbing hanging 8 feet high. I wrote in my logbook, personnel missing, Private, J. Morrison, 0400 hours, search ongoing. My hand wanted to write Aswang, and I made it stop. I wrote, possible hostile, indigenous activity, investigation continues. It felt like lying to the paper itself. That night, we set an ambush. If it was men, insurgents, collaborators, anyone human, men could bleed. If it was an animal, some jungle predator we hadn't accounted for, animals could die. And if it was something else, we would at least see its shape. We would name it, and maybe naming it would make it smaller. We dug fighting positions in the mud, hung lanterns at intervals to create pools of light and pockets of shadow we controlled, laid down overlapping fields of fire that would catch anything moving through the perimeter, salt rings around every tent, ash lines reinforcing every threshold. Garlic hung so thick from the ridgepoles that the whole camp smelled like an Italian grandmother's kitchen. Ramos handed each of us a buntot podgy, a stingray tail whip, leather-wrapped handle, the barbed tail itself dried to black horn. For when the bullets lie, he said. He didn't smile when he said it. He hadn't smiled in days. The jungle watched us prepare. I know how that sounds. I know the jungle is just trees and water, and things that live between them. But I felt eyes on my back as I checked my rifle for the 3rd time. I felt a tension as I positioned myself behind a fallen log with clear sightlines to the balit. The forest was aware of us in a way I'd never experienced before. Aware and waiting. You think you'll know when it starts. A shout, a muzzle flash, men grabbing weapons and scrambling to positions. The chaos of contact. It didn't start like that. It started with the tin cans ringing against each other while the leaves hung perfectly still. It started with the antenna wire humming that thin high note, like a glass about to shatter from a frequency you can't hear. It started with the lamp flame in front of me pinching down to a blue point, then stretching tall and thin as if something had leaned in close and drawn a long, hungry breath. I saw eyes first. 2 red points, low in the brush beyond our perimeter lights, too far apart to be human, too steady to be animal. They didn't reflect our lamplight the way normal eyes would, flaring and fading with movement. These glowed from within, a dull, constant crimson like banked coals in a dead fireplace. They blinked sideways, not up and down like our eyes do, side to side, like a fish, like something that had learned to wear eyes but hadn't quite figured out all the details. I told my finger not to tighten on the trigger. My finger didn't listen. Branches creaked above us, not wind creak, weight creak. Something heavy and jointed moving along the ridgepole of the supply tent. I could see the canvas dipping with it, the support lines shifting, the shape of pressure moving from one end to the other. Then something leaned out from the canvas edge. Not a head. Not exactly. More like a shoulder and an elbow at angles that didn't match any skeleton I'd studied in school. The joints bent wrong, backward. Too many points of articulation. The tongue was what broke me. It came down through the bamboo slats of Steinberg's sleeping shelter, like a black rope being lowered inch by inch, thin and dark and glistening wet. It moved with purpose, tasting the air, sliding over his mosquito netting, brushing against his gear where it hung from a nail. I could hear it making small wet sounds each time it touched something. Tap, tap, like a finger testing whether fruit is ripe. The sound was close, so close I could have reached out and touched the canvas where the thing crouched. But the tick-tick clicking came from far away, out by the river. The distance lie working exactly as the old woman had warned. Villanueva cracked his stingray whip into the rafters. The sound split the night, a sharp snap like a gunshot's angrier cousin. And the darkness answered. A shriek from above us, not outside, above. Inside the perimeter, inside our lights, right on top of us. It was dry and sharp, like a bat's cry stretched and twisted until it learned how to scream like a woman being murdered. The tongue whipped back into the darkness. The canvas shifted violently as weight redistributed. Then the roof gave way. A waterfall of bamboo slats and palm thatch and something else. A smell like rancid meat, like spoiled fish, like death wearing perfume, came pouring down into Steinberg's shelter. He rolled clear, screaming something that might have been a prayer or a curse or both. I threw salt, grabbed a handful from the pouch on my belt, and hurled it into the collapsing mess of canvas and shadow. Useless. Like throwing snow at a forest fire. The granules scattered and fell and did nothing visible except make the shrieking angrier. We fired then, not panicked, not at first, controlled pairs into the brush where those red eyes had been, into the mass of debris where the shape had fallen, into the darkness beyond our lights, because that's where the sounds were coming from. And a rifle is the only answer a soldier has for fear. The brush exploded with movement. Something came out of the vegetation line and my mind refused to process it. For 1 second, one eternal second, it looked like a woman cut off at the waist, the ragged edge of her torso trailing something that might have been intestines or might have been roots, ribs visible through torn flesh like the slats of a broken barrel, arms too long and bent at too many joints, wings folding behind her with a sound like wet canvas being shaken out. Her face was almost beautiful, almost human, smiling. Then she was just shadow. Then she was the space between the trees. Then she was the sound of beating wings receding into a distance that might have been 50 yards or 50 miles. Something hit Kowalski from behind. Not claws, not teeth. Something blunt and fast and filled with hate. He went down hard, breath driven out of him, in a grunt, and Holloway was there dragging him by the collar before I could move. The supply tent collapsed completely. Someone was screaming, might have been me. A shape rushed past my left side, and I felt cold instead of heat where it brushed my shoulder. That was wrong. You get hit in combat, you feel fire. This was ice. This was winter reaching in through my skin and touching the bone beneath. I swung my rifle butt at empty air and connected with nothing except a smell I hope I never smell again. We pushed it back with chaos, salt thrown in fistfuls, the stingray whips cracking at sounds and shadows, Steinberg's lighter fluid splashing across the threshold of his ruined shelter, and someone, Ramos, I think, touching a match to it so a wall of fire separated us from whatever was out there. The shriek came again, further now, or closer. The sound lied and kept lying. Out in the darkness, something that might have been a pig stood on the path watching us with eyes that caught our firelight and threw it back wrong. When its head turned to track Holloway's movement, the neck bent at an impossible angle, behind where a spine should stop, behind where bones should prevent. Then it was gone, not running, just gone. Like someone had taken an eraser to the edge of reality and rubbed it out. The tin can stopped ringing. The wire stopped humming. The fire Ramos had started flickered down to normal flames that followed normal rules. We counted off. We always count after contact. Kowalski was down with a gash across his shoulder blades that looked like it had been made by something with 3 points. Steinberg had a cut on his forearm that wouldn't stop bleeding. The rest of us were intact, at least physically. The roosters should have been crowing. Dawn was close enough to taste. But the chicken coop by the supply tent was silent. When we checked it, 3 hens lay inside. White meat on bamboo sticks. No blood, no mess, just empty. Like something had unzipped them and drunk what was inside without disturbing the feathers. I stared at that for a long time. No tracks, no entry point, no explanation that fit the world I'd been trained to believe in. At full light, we walked the perimeter looking for evidence, for spent brass we'd fired, for blood trails, for anything that could go in a report without making us sound like men who'd lost their minds. In the dust by the radio tent, we found a trail, Like someone had dragged a rope dipped in dark oil. It wandered toward the balit and stopped at the roots. The marks on the bamboo weren't from claws. Not exactly. They were from something that had pressed and pulled. Sucker marks, maybe. Or something worse. A smear on a palm leaf looked like blood, but didn't bead the way blood does. It sat flat, almost dry, almost alive. We put it in an evidence bag because soldiers put things in bags when they don't know what else to do. We labeled it with time and date and grid coordinates because forms make the impossible feel manageable. The villagers returned with the sun. They didn't say, "We told you so." They just reset the salt lines and ash barriers, tucked more garlic into our shelters, spat vinegar in X patterns on our tent poles. Lola Inde told us not to sleep on our backs. "Protect the belly," she said. "That is where it enters." We didn't argue. We didn't laugh. Men like to think they're above superstition, above fear, above the rules that govern the dark. We weren't. Not anymore. Rosario cried without making a sound, hands pressed against her stomach like she was trying to hold a door closed. Ramos finally met my eyes when I asked him what he thought we should do. He looked at the balit, the tree that had watched everything and would keep watching long after we were gone. "We should leave," he said. "Soon, before it knows our names." By then, nobody was laughing at anything anymore, not even Holloway. We burned what we couldn't carry by mid-morning. That's a sin in a place where people build their walls from grass and their hopes from bamboo. Every stick of lumber, every palm frond, every piece of canvas that might give shelter to a family. We put it to the torch because we couldn't risk leaving anything behind that it might use. Might remember us by. The smoke rose black and bitter into a sky that didn't care. We buried the trash that wouldn't burn, smashed the antenna we'd worked 2 days to erect, coiled the wire and left the poles to rot in the mud. We filled our pockets with ammunition and salt because both felt like plans, even though one of them shouldn't have. We started for the coast in a single file line, stretched thin along a trail that barely deserved the name, muddy as a creek bed, narrow as a goat path. You could hear water moving somewhere nearby but couldn't see it, and what you could see was worse, mangrove roots like bones, shadows that didn't match the trees casting them, birds that watched but didn't sing. I walked third in line, behind Holloway and ahead of Steinberg, kept my eyes on the mud and tried not to think about Morrison's boot prints changing into something else between one step and the next. Tried not to see it happening to our tracks, right now, right behind us. Halfway up the ridge, where the trail switchbacked through a stand of bamboo, a length of rattan vine hung across our path, placed there like a clothesline, deliberate and wrong. At the end of it, swinging in a breeze that didn't exist, were dog tags, Morrison's dog tags. The metal clinked softly against itself, his name stamped in the aluminum, his serial number, his blood type, the bureaucratic summary of a life hanging from a vine 12 feet above the ground, in a place with no footprints below, no sign of climbing, no explanation that belonged in a world with rules. We stood there and looked at it. None of us moved to take it down. I'm not proud of that. I'm not ashamed either. We weren't going to stand under that vine any longer than it took to read the name and say it quietly, like a prayer for someone we couldn't bury. "Morrison," Holloway said. His voice cracked on the second syllable. "Danny Morrison." Then we walked on, left him hanging there, left whatever was watching know that we knew, and we were leaving. And we weren't playing anymore. The beach came at dusk, wide and gray, the sand packed hard by tides that came and went without caring about the war or the things that hunted in the interior. We built a fire from driftwood that didn't want to catch and smoked like it was angry about being burned. We ate hardtack that made our teeth ache and drank water that tasted like canvas and didn't talk. Steinberg tried to tell a joke about a sailor and a mermaid. He forgot the punchline twice and gave up. Kowalski stared at his shoulder bandage like it belonged to someone else. Villanueva sat on an overturned boat hull and sharpened a knife that was already sharper than any knife needed to be. Ramos watched the tree line. I wrote the incident report by lamplight, with my pad balanced on my knee, tried to make it sound like something a captain in a clean office wouldn't throw away. Hostile, indigenous activity, night contact, missing in action Private Morrison. Evidence suggests animal predation consistent with large nocturnal species, possible vampire bat colony. Recommend avoidance of ballet tree formations, maintain strict light discipline. Local population advises salt barriers. I crossed out the last line. It looked wrong on an army form. Everything looked wrong. The whole report was a lie written in regulation format, and the truth was something I couldn't put in any language the army spoke. The next morning, a Filipino runner found us on the beach. Young kid, maybe 16, running dispatches between units that were already falling apart. He carried news that made our little nightmare seem almost quaint. Bombs up north, landings on Luzon. The Japanese had come in force, and everything we'd been preparing for had started without asking permission. New orders cut through the radio static. Fall back to secondary positions, link up with larger units. Prepare for evacuation procedures that everyone knew would never come in time. The war had caught up with us. And somehow, impossibly, it felt like a relief. We turned our paperwork over to a lieutenant fresh from the States, so knew his bars still had factory shine. Butter bar, we called them. Officers green enough to believe in forms and procedures and chains of command that hadn't existed in months. He looked at my evidence bag with the hair sample and the bloody smear and asked what it was. I told him I didn't know. He wrote "dispose" in pencil on the tag and set it aside like yesterday's newspaper. I watched him do it and said nothing. What was there to say? The truth would have gotten me a Section 8 and a ticket to a hospital where they'd teach me not to believe what I'd seen. The lie let me keep walking, keep fighting, keep pretending the world made sense for a little while longer. We went back through the village to say what passes for goodbye when you're leaving people to their own monsters. Rosario's house had more salt than wood by then. Garlic hung from every beam like some kind of desperate harvest. Her sister stood in the doorway with an axe across her knees, not sleeping, just waiting. Lola Inde found me as I passed, small hand gripping my wrist with strength that didn't match her age. She pressed the buntot pagi into my palm, the stingray tail whip, the one I'd left hanging on the supply tent post. "Keep it," she said, "for when your bullets lie again." I tried to give it back. She closed my fingers around it until the bones pressed together and the leather dug into my skin. "You will need it. Maybe not here, maybe not soon, but you will need it." Then she was gone, moving back into the smoke and shadows of the village like she was made of them, like she'd always been made of them. Ramos left his own whip behind, hooked over the threshold of the captain's house. He finally met my eyes as we formed up to move out. "You won't write this," he said. Not a question, not a suggestion, just a fact, stated plainly. I said no. He nodded like that was the only answer worth giving. We started up the track toward the coast, with our packs feeling heavier than they should. The clouds were stacking over the sea, building toward something that might have been rain or might have been worse. The Balit stood behind us at the edge of the village, unchanged, unburned, watching us leave like it had watched everything else that had ever passed beneath its twisted branches. If I turned just right, I could put it behind a palm trunk and make it disappear from view. That trick worked, as long as I didn't breathe. The road south was chaos. Trucks breaking down, men walking who should have been riding. Names of towns that would be rubble by Christmas, spoken like prayers by boys who didn't know what prayer meant yet. We folded into a larger unit and lost our individual shape in the mass of the retreat. That's what happens in war. The edges blur. The units merge. The men you knew become faces you remember, and then faces you forget. In Manila, a captain took my incident report and filed it under a stack of papers that were already being packed for evacuation. He stamped the date on the corner without reading past the first paragraph. I watched the ink dry and thought about how paper outlasts men, how forms survive when bodies don't, how the truth gets buried under procedure and stays buried. Maybe that's why we write things down. Maybe that's why I'm talking now. Holloway found me that evening, smoking a cigarette I didn't want. He offered me another one. I said no and took it anyway. "We don't talk about it," he said. Not asking, telling. "No." "Good." He walked away, and I never saw him again. His name showed up on a casualty list 6 weeks later, Baton, where a lot of names showed up and stopped meaning anything except numbers on a form. Steinberg made it out, told me years later that he still couldn't look at bats the same way, couldn't eat fish sauce, couldn't sleep with the window open. Kowalski died of malaria in a prison camp. Villanueva went underground with the guerrillas and came out the other side of the war a different man who wouldn't talk about the years in between. Ramos. I never heard what happened to Ramos. Some men just vanish, and the records don't bother to explain. I signed the ledger where it said, "Missing in action." Wrote Morrison's name in neat letters that the Army taught me. My initials at the bottom. The rain smudged the last line before the ink dried. That's a small thing. It stayed with me more than the blood smell, more than the tongue sliding through the ceiling slats, more than the eyes that blinked sideways. There's a way that men like me end these stories. Around campfires, in bars, at reunions where we pretend the bonds forged in horror are something to celebrate. You say you still hear the sound at night. You say it found you again somewhere else, some other jungle, some other dark place. You say you wake up and your feet are muddy and you don't remember walking. I won't feed you that. I won't pretend this story is tidy. What happened next was simple. We followed orders because that's what soldiers do. We moved south and then east and then onto ships that took us away from islands we'd failed to defend. We lost men to bullets and fevers and the kind of bad luck that comes on trucks with bald tires and happens too fast to dodge. We sent messages and received orders and ate rice that tasted like nothing and missed home until missing was all we were. Sometimes, in places with no trees and no shadows, I remembered the touch on my shoulder, cold instead of hot, the wrongness of that, the way my bones felt like they'd been packed in ice from the inside out. And I'd have to move to a different chair, turn on another light, find some noise to fill the silence before the silence filled me. I made it home in 45. Kissed soil I'd never appreciated before the war made me grateful for dirt that didn't hide things in it. Got married to a woman who didn't ask about the stingray tail in my footlocker. Had kids who grew up thinking their father's nightmares were about Germans and Japanese and all the normal monsters of their history books. Years later, decades later, a museum curator came to my door, old himself by then, but young compared to me. He was collecting artifacts from the Pacific Theater, he said, anything authentic. Anything with a story. I told him I'd lost everything. That was a lie. The stingray tail was still in my drawer, brittle and black and cracked at the handle where too many years had dried the leather. I oil it sometimes, not often. Just enough to keep it from falling apart in my hands. That's not a ritual. That's not a spell. That's just maintenance. Keeping something from the past alive long enough to remember why it mattered. If you want a moral from this, I don't have one. If you want a monster, you can pick from several. Maybe it was a bat that learned people believe in stories and decided to hide inside one. Maybe it was a story that learned how to wear a bat. Maybe it was hunger with a face. Maybe it was just the jungle doing what jungles do, swallowing men who think they understand it and spitting out whatever's left. We left Capiz under gray skies and orders we didn't get to argue with. The rain pressed down the dust and made everything smell clean for exactly 1 minute. One breath where the air tasted like fresh starts instead of endings. Then we were in the trucks and moving, and the smell was diesel again, and sweat and fear. The ballet, when I think of it now, isn't a tree anymore. It's a place where the trail stops, and something that isn't quite memory waits to see if I'll forget the rules. I won't forget them. But I don't know if that matters. I don't know if the rules ever mattered, or if we just told ourselves they did, because the alternative was admitting we were helpless. That some things can't be stopped with salt lines and garlic braids. That some hungers don't respect thresholds. On the morning we pulled out of the village, a clerk shoved a form at me and a pen that barely had any ink left. I wrote what they told me to write: unit designation, date, location, one line for Morrison following the format, name, rank, serial number, status, missing in action. The ink bled a little where the page had gotten damp. The clerk didn't look at me when he took it back. He had 50 more names to process and a convoy to catch. That's how it ended for us in Capiz. Not with a confrontation, not with understanding, not with a campfire revelation that tied the loose ends together. It ended with a wet signature in a book that no one would ever read, a dull stamp in the corner, the sound of truck engines grinding through gears as we pulled away from a place that kept its own time. The trees watched us leave. I felt them watching even with my back turned. And sometimes now, when the night gets quiet enough and the dark gets thick enough, I think I can still hear it. Tick-tick. Faint. Almost inaudible. The trick that means close. And I check the salt lines I keep by my doors. Check the garlic I hang in my closet where my wife thinks it's just an old man's strange habit. Check the stingray tail in its drawer to make sure it hasn't crumbled to dust. So far, so good. So far. So, that's the end of our video. If you made it this far, make sure to hit like and subscribe. It really helps the channel, and it's completely free. And if you want more terrifying encounters like this one, check out the other videos on screen right now. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there. See you soon.